Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give a minute or two for people to join us before we make a start. Great. I think, so shall we make a start, Stuart?
Yeah, let's make a start. Yeah.
Great. Good morning, all. Thank you for coming today and taking time to attend this webinar. Our webinar is, the topic is, I've already lost my words. So the topic is, did COVID-19 change who we are? And our guest speaker for today is Dr. Stuart Dizon. He's CEO of a global selection and development company, Lumina Learning. And I'll be introducing him to you properly in a minute. And just wanted to kind of quickly introduce myself and then do a couple of housekeeping points before I hand you over to Stuart. So I'm Reina Gundala, founder of Talent Grader. For those of you who are not aware of Talent Grader, we are a thriving startup, a dedicated platform for promoting talent assessments. And so a couple of housekeeping points. The session will last for 45 minutes and it's being recorded. We'll share the slides with you after the session, along with the recording of the session. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A function. So not the chat function, but the Q&A function. So I'll be kind of sharing your questions with Stuart as we go along. So I have a great pleasure in collaborating with Lumina Learning to bring this webinar to you. Very important topic. And Stuart will take us through the impact of remote working on workplace behaviors, trends, personality, and culture. So very much looking forward to this session with you today, Stuart. Thank you. And just a couple of words about Stuart is an expert psychometrician and has designed the well-renowned Lumina Spark personality model. And I had great pleasure in attending and being a practitioner. Thoroughly enjoyed the profile and enjoying sharing with the organizations at the moment as well. And to name some of the specialities that Stuart brings as organizational development, team effectiveness, exec coaching, and leadership skill development. And he's also on the management board of Association of Business Psychologists and a chartered fellow of CIPD. So without further ado, Stuart, over to you.
So Renu, thank you for your kind words of introduction, and I'm excited to be here to share for maybe the next 45 minutes something on the research I've been doing on the impact of the COVID crisis on who we are, our personalities, but also our response in terms of do we want to go back to face-to-face working, and those of us that are in HR, when will we be doing our workshops again face-to-face? So these are some of the things that I'll be addressing today. At the end, I will send out to everyone that's on the call here today a short research paper summarizing it, as well as the PowerPoints. And I will be orientating you as well to the Lumina Spark model of personality, which has been used in the research that I'm about to share with you. So if I dive straight in here I'll go into PowerPoint, and if we have a quick look, so that's me. You'll see there's this splash, which is the mark of personality has been used in this research to see has our personality been impacted. More on this later. Also going to have a look, when are we going to get back to workshops? Has there been a structural shift in our desire for face-to-face, and has it really changed who we are? So just a few words on Lumina. We do create personality tools with smart data, simple language. We challenge the status quo of how things are measured. So in this research, you'll see we believe this is a more accurate, valid way of measuring personality and any behavioral change in a crisis. We are about getting people continuously curious and excited about their behavior in selection and development, or their behavior in a crisis as well. And in the past, we've worked in the last decade to sort of understand personality. Now we're looking at how we deliver it in a more interactive and engaging way, including being digital. And I'm on a bit of a mission, so the vision here, to transform organizations by celebrating people one human at a time. That's what we're about, and that's the context for this research. And we have lots of products. So I'm really just going to be using the Spark model today for research purposes, but we also do measure things in terms of the impact of the crisis, in terms of teamwork, in terms of our emotional intelligence, our leadership, and so on. We are global, so each dot is a community of practitioners. So Lumina is a global organization. And you'll see in the model we use today, when we look at the impact of the crisis, we look at the impact on all the different ways of being. So we value people truly inclusively. We don't box them or label them. You'll see when we look at this, the data that we've used here to look at the impact of the crisis and remote working is really rich and detailed, but it's also quite simple in terms of color and language. And everything I'm going to share here works in a virtual context. So a few words about the research team. There's actually 4 of us on this research team. I'm one of the 4 researchers. And we had over 4,000 people surveyed globally, 4,414 to get there. And this initial research was done last summer at the peak of the pandemic to get people's views and responses to it. We've also looked at research more recently on organizations and how they view face-to-face work. And we've done some modeling on the impact of COVID. This is some data from last year, which said, of the 4,400 people, which countries have handled this crisis well? And the turquoise here says it's been handled well. So New Zealand, Taiwan, and China, the employees of big organizations there think their governments have handled it well. Who's handled it badly? Madagascar, US, Brazil, Hong Kong, Spain, the UK, generally speaking. And this, of course, is before the vaccines came in, but before the vaccines, we viewed that it wasn't handled so well. So I'm going to go interactive from the start, because part of the research was, do we want to keep working remotely, or do we want to get back to work? So I'm going to ask you to use the annotate feature here. So if you could move your cursor around until you find the menu option, click on the annotate button. And when you look at annotate, go over and click on stamp and then find the star button. And if, like me, I never really worked remotely very much, but now I'm working remotely 100%. But going back, when the vaccine kicks in, I probably want to work remotely some of the time. So my star is going in this middle box. And I'd like all of us to have a go at doing that now with the stamp feature. Now, if for any reason you may be on a phone or you can't get the stamp thing to work, then if you go to the chat box, if you just indicate which box you want to put your stamp in, I can put it in there for you if for any reason you can't get the stamp functionality to work. So have a go at doing that now. So Patricia is saying some of the time, so you're there with me. I'll have another stamp in there. Jean is saying some of the time. Yeah. Chris is as well. Kate is saying most of the time. Yep. Dan, some of the time. Mark, some of the time. Most of the time. Another vote there. Some of the time, another one. Okay, the votes are coming in. I've not had anyone yet say some of the time, another some of the time. Not getting anyone yet saying all of the time or none of the time. I'm looking for anyone at the polarities. Not yet. So that's quite interesting. So it seems that most of us on the call here today, probably from a HR background, we want to work remotely some of the time, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, and some of us more often. I'll share some data on this a little bit later, so I won't give you the results on that yet. I'll tease you a little bit, but these results, and they're not inconsistent, I think, with what's been found elsewhere. So you may have noticed in the press recently that Dropbox have had a policy of moving away from a hybrid model of remote working and also in an office, and they have a virtual first policy, interestingly, because they think if you don't do that, then it's not inclusive of the people who are working remotely. I think this is an interesting trend. Some of the big banks have gone down, back to the office, and some of the more progressives have said, no, we're going completely virtual, like Nationwide, you can work anywhere in any one of their offices, and Dropbox is virtual first. Interesting. Just thought I'd share that data with you. At Lumina, we have been working with businesses face-to-face to a limited extent over the last 12 months. And of course, it is a rigmarole. There are all sorts of rules on the windows open and where we store the bags and sanitizers. We often have a mat and work in a workshop. So how far apart does everybody have to be? And this is what we have been doing and are continuing to do. Of course, we'll only really get back to face-to-face when we can lift some of these restrictions. And I thought it might be interesting to look at, when do we think we really will lift these restrictions? Now, obviously, it varies a lot by country. This is data on flights, the number of flights that have been booked. And what it basically shows is actually globally, domestic air travel is like at 80% of what it was a year ago. It's international travel that's been hammered. So people are traveling to go and do workshops and meet people in quite a lot of countries. It's just the international consulting that's taken such a massive hammering. And when you look at it, this data is based on seat capacity. The amount of travel that's happening, it's really Europe that is the epicenter of the travel ban and the sort of lack of face-to-face workshops from people moving around countries. So 73% down the travel across Europe. Interestingly, the US domestically is only 27% down. And amazingly, China is up on pre-pandemic levels. So in China, people are now traveling and working more than they were before. And a key part of this is that the US is blocking travel from Europe. And if we look at that, it's not really justifiable by the data. It's more of a political decision. So I would suggest that might change in the near future. And the obvious reason for that is vaccinations. If you look at how many people have received at least one dose, you'll see that the UK, the US, Canada, we're up there. And Europe, after a slow start, is rapidly catching up and may even at some point overtake the UK in the coming months. And the vaccines are the really answer to a lot of these problems. Will the Indian variant destroy it and cause us to not be going back to face-to-face? I don't think so. If you look at this graph here, these are the people who've been vaccinated, and this is just looking at Bolton in the north of England. The vaccinated people, there's been very little change in the incidence of COVID. It's the unvaccinated people that unfortunately are causing the higher rate. So as long as we keep our vaccine program going, I don't think the Indian variant will be as bad as we might have feared. Now, this is data from the GBTA, which is a survey of a very recent survey of people in large organizations, asking them, do you think really you're going to be doing more face-to-face or more virtual? The green here indicates they think they'll do more. So after the vaccines have kicked in and when we're successful, and this is a survey of people that plan and book the travel in big companies, they're saying, actually, we think virtual is here to stay, even after it's over. Even for sales calls, people are thinking, do salespeople need to get back out there? They're still saying actually more virtual. And this, if you like, is the reverse questions. Do we think we're going to be doing more or less face-to-face meetings? So the people in the know that book business travel for big companies are saying this seems to be a permanent attitudinal shift in a move towards going remote. And of course, going remote and working virtually, it's not really a new thing. What the crisis has done is just accelerated what was already happening, although accelerated it quite dramatically. Now, in my research of 4,414 people globally, which was from all over the world, I asked people if they'd like to work remotely or not once it's done. So these are the questions you answered. And I think today on the call, we're similar to the 4,000 people globally. 48%, say half of the population, and this is UK, China, US, very consistent. People that didn't work remotely and have now experienced it are saying, I want to do this at least some of the time. And a third are saying, I want to do it most of the time. There's a hardcore that says, I hate working remotely. No, so 1 in 10, I don't want to. And 12% say, I want to do it all the time. This is people, by the way, who are office workers who have the option to work remotely. So this doesn't include, people in roles where it's not possible. So there's still 1 in 10 people that actually hate having to work remotely for whatever reason. So the 4,400 people filled in a raft of surveys about their emotional, physical well-being, their risk-taking, their experience of technology in the crisis, some psychological measures, including positivity, their response to stress, their emotional intelligence, as well as an assessment of the risk to their mental health. This was an extremely comprehensive global survey. And in this survey, it focused on people essentially in white-collar roles, who 71% employed, 9% self-employed. So 4 out of 5 were actually in employment, some were laid off, and actually 82% had a degree. So this is 4,414 highly educated people globally who are largely in employment. And this is the spread over the world, a slightly higher weighting for the UK in the data and a slightly higher weighting for the Northern Hemisphere, but we had people in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Taiwan, India, Middle East take part in this, including in mainly Brazil, in South America, and so on. So what are the implications for those of us on the call here today that are involved in decision making? Well, what challenges have you faced in starting to work remotely? As you would expect, the biggest one is a lack of contact face-to-face and a difficulty in separating home and work life. So 1 in 5 people said, I'm really missing the contact face-to-face, and almost 1 in 5 said, I can't separate out my personal and my home life well enough. My workspace at home is not ideal, just over 15%. I'm getting distracted, that would be me, 15%, and so on. Inadequate equipment was coming in a bit lower than I expected. So just under 10% of people are saying the kit is not correct. That didn't seem to be the biggest problem, interestingly. This is very interesting because this is an assessment of the mental health risk. So we used an industry measure of a mental health risk that people filled in. And the biggest finding was that when we correlated it with how well the organization communicated, if the organization did not give clear expectations, but just made people work remotely and the communication didn't improve, then this scale along the bottom said they had a higher risk of a mental health episode. And if you look at the bottom bar, for staff who were communicated well with, and they were sure they were meeting expectations, good communication in the crisis, their risk of mental health went right down. That's a very interesting finding for all of us in HR around what you need to do to help people work remotely. Why do we want to work remotely? Well, actually, this is staggering. 4,400 people globally, consistently across the world, 40% of them. So like almost 2,000 were saying, I saved time due to not commuting. And I'm loving not commuting. I used to go to London several times a week, not anymore. I quite like saving that time. And this really says, what do people do with it? Well, I've got a better life balance. I've saved money not commuting. Many people said it's greener not to commute. I can spend more time with my family and friends. And if you're anything like me, I'm willing to admit I have been sleeping more. The time I've saved on all this commuting, I actually personally feel healthier and more rested. There are some other benefits: better work-life balance, more autonomy is a big one, and more productivity. And this was moderated by the psychology of the individual. So people whose personality traits were more inclined to be optimistic, they kept thinking the crisis will end sooner than it had. And the people who were more confident, they tended to also say, and I'm more productive, and I love this autonomy. So that was an interesting finding there as well. Why do we not want to work remotely? Well, you'll see the scale. There are much less people reporting that they didn't want to work remotely. But the key challenge was, I'm losing the connection with my colleagues. My workspace at home is not good. And some people said, actually, I'm less productive. So it's very mixed, the view on productivity. And for some people, it's not possible. For some people, it makes their work-life balance worse, and so on. So equally good reasons for not liking it. So what should we do? Many of you on the call today are employers. What are the top key things that staff are saying they need? Now, remember, this is across the globe. The top thing is 50% of people, so over 2,000 out of 4,500 said, please, employer, help me work remotely more effectively. Give me better tools, give me better support, and help me manage the stress, not just of the pandemic, but of this new way of working. Help me balance things, help me be safe. this is really interesting. Coming in at number 5 is give me more emotional support. And Lumina, we provide psychometrics, and there's been an uptake in people doing work around emotions, emotional intelligence, and that actually was coming in ahead of the desire for better technical support. So let me say a few words about the Lumina model, and then I'll show you how our personality has been impacted by this crisis. So everyone have a look at these words here. These are 24 words that measure bits of our personality. I'd like you all to choose one word, and I'd like you to choose a word that you think in the last 12 months in lockdown, you've had to use a bit more of it, you've relied on it. So for me, I'm going to go for my imagination, because I've had to figure out how to do things differently. So we'll choose a word, and I've color coded it according to how they correlate. And actually, my background is statistics and psychometrics. If we cluster these words together, they go into threes and they form a circular model. And this is the model of personality that's been used in this research. And in fact, it's based on a theory called the Big Five, which is an empirical model of how personality hangs together. And I can sort of summarize that for you in a graphic like this. So in the crisis, some people became more inspiration driven. They went with the flow a bit, gave up their need to control. Some of us, like me, responded by trying to reinvent our businesses and think things through differently. That's big picture thinking. Those are my qualities. Some of us had an extroverted response. Interestingly, not many. This was the least likely response in the crisis, but some people became more persuasive and animated. Some people became outcome focused. This was quite common with people working at home, particularly when they overdid it and became a little bit more argumentative in their own homes. That's a trend in the data. Many of you became more disciplined in the crisis. Okay, I'm going to plan my way out of this problem. Some of us, and this was probably one of the biggest, became more cautious. So the impact of the pandemic, which makes us risk averse, has overspilled into other areas of our life. And there's even a problem with some people becoming agoraphobic, and they've got used to being at home and they don't really want to come out of the house anymore. So the experience of all that caution is spilling over. Some people have become more introverted and contained. And at the top left here, many people have had a very empathetic response to the crisis. Here's a splash, which is how we measure the personality. So bottom line, has it changed who we are? Well, actually, the context in which we live and work's changed. Our thinking's changed. There's research here that says we're less positive than we were before. We're more anxious, but we're not thinking as positively. Our feelings and emotions have changed. We have become collectively as a planet more anxious. If you're on the moon looking down, anxiety's gone up. Our behaviours changed. We have become in our homes slightly more argumentative. We've also become less spontaneous and less sociable. And our response to stress has changed. We're slightly more stressed than we were before in the last 12 months. These are quite interesting findings. Now, whether this is permanent or not is an interesting point. I'm not saying we've permanently changed forever, but the context changed, that's for sure. The key finding, well, the genie is out the bottle. As you've all indicated today, you want to work, all of you today want to work remotely, either some or a lot of the time. There's only 10% that are saying, please go back to the old days. And if I was to distill it into 3 key messages for employers: 1, increase your communication with colleagues and everybody. It will help everybody's mental health as well as being good practice. 2, there's a need for more coaching and support around emotional well-being. People are more open to that, particularly in the Western countries, and give people more practical support on how to work remotely with technology and new working practice. Those are the top 3 things people are asking for. Has there been an impact on mental health? Well, there has. In the 4,400 people, 11% were reporting issues with mental health during this crisis. And remember, this is educated people in office environments. There is a cultural split, so some countries are more open to disclosing this, but it still exists across the board. Productivity is an interesting one. So people that are more confident and optimistic are reporting that they've become more productive. People whose personalities are naturally more cautious and anxious are less likely to report an increase in productivity or a decrease. In terms of autonomy, many more of us are reporting, if we didn't work remotely and now we do, people are saying, I like the autonomy I've been experiencing. And that's why we don't want to, many of us, go back to working all the time in the office. So quick survey now. I'd like you to use the stamp functionality again. Now, during the last 12 months, have you been feeling anxious compared to before? So I'm going to say I've been feeling, in truth, I'm going to tick much more anxious for me. So I've had to deal with how to handle furloughing of staff and I've had to handle making stuff go virtual very, very quickly. So for me, I've been much more anxious, but some of you, my son Joshua, who's 18 years old, he's less anxious. He quite likes not going to school and so on. It's, you know, all honesty, he communicates with his friends on social media. So it's not true that we're all more anxious. So maybe have a few votes there, say some more votes are coming. Let's have a look here. So Mark saying about the same, slightly less from Anne, much less anxious for me. Yeah, great. Less anxious. Patricia about the same. Okay, so we're getting quite a spread from all of us here today, which shows that individual differences are much more important actually than, you know, complete global global averages. So if I move on and have a look, and I'll share with you some of the actual data here from the 4,000. 59% of people, now remember this data was gathered in the peak of last summer and going into the autumn. 59% of people were feeling more anxious, and that is very consistent across the globe. 56% were feeling more disconnected from their colleagues, particularly those working remotely. Isolation was up. People, 39% were feeling more excluded, and 43% were feeling more lonely. So that's why I say, looking down from the moon, the planet has become a more anxious place in the last 12 months. This is a bit detailed, but just let me give you the headlines. It breaks the data down into those who work remote and on site. The grey bar, people like me, I was working in an office and now I'm completely remote. The orange bar are people who were remote, but they were remote anyway. And the blue bar are the people who've had to consistently go into the office through the crisis. And you're not so affected by loneliness or exclusion if you already work remotely. Not such an issue. In fact, you're feeling more included. Isolation is worse if you're people like me that are working remotely for the first time. And disconnection is at its peak if you've gone into a remote working for the first time. Anxiety actually is bigger if you've been forced to work in the office throughout the crisis. Two sources of anxiety. One is I have to keep working and I'm at risk of the virus. And the other is the economic anxiety. I might lose my job, or how might it impact me? Autonomy has gone up most and productivity most if you've experienced working remotely for the first time. Other research says that the people who have been impacted personality-wise most are the people who are what we call risk reactors. So they're normally quite vigilant, they see risks and so on. And that's where the feelings of loneliness and anxiety have increased more. And the people who are feeling more productive and autonomous are the people who are what we call reward reactors. They're more likely to keep a lid on their emotions and go into the workplace in a more confident mode. And so there's a difference there in personality. So this is the model. This actually, with permission, is my partner Deb. This is her splash before COVID. Disciplined, outcome focused, extroverted were her big things. This is measuring her personality during the crisis. She became less disciplined because she couldn't control it all. She became more inspiration driven and go with the flow, actually because she had to. Her big picture thinking went up because she became, out of necessity, more reflective and considered as she thought through her role and what to do with the rest of her life, which the crisis was a perverse gift on that. We do measure in this research who you are underneath, how you behave every day. and what you do when you overextend under pressure. And this is my colleague Nikita, again used with permission. This is Nikita before the crisis. These are all the bars of all the things we've measured in his personality. And when we measured him during the crisis, if I go back, that's before and that's during, you'll see the big increase, and I've highlighted it in green. Not a huge change, but actually he became more collaborative and he became more empathetic. But he became more empathetic in an overextended way. He found his emotions were tiring him during the crisis. We all have our individual responses. This is what we've been using a lot in coaching people around their well-being, to help individuals look at their response and what they can do to handle it more effectively. So I'm going to ask you now to be really honest and disclose here, what sort of dysfunctional or overextended behaviours have you experienced? And I'm going to get you to stamp it again. So I'm going to be honest. I'm going to put a few clicks down here on argumentative, because my family tell me I've been unfortunately more argumentative. In the next room is my son is working, in the kitchen one of my other sons, and elsewhere in the house my wife is working. We've got 4 people working at home, so there's plenty of scope for arguing. But if you could put a stamp on here, or if you put it in the box, you can just indicate the area of the mandala and I'll put a stamp on for you. So let's be honest. So Anne saying she's become impulsive. Thank you for admitting that. I'll put a few stars around there for Anne. Anyone else want to put some stars on? Where else have we?
Good. We've got one from Kuntal, outcome focused.
Outcome focused. Okay, that's a mark. So yeah. So sort of, and the risk of that is we're being direct, but we might seek conflict, or we're trying to win. Yeah, and Jean saying hesitant. Yeah, we can become, a common response has been just to pull back and lose some of our confidence at acting. It's spilled over from concern about the crisis. Yeah. Okay, you get the idea. And this is also what's been measured in our research. Thank you, narrow-sighted, coming in as well. Yeah. So if we, I'll just save that, just share it with you in the follow-up, and we'll have a look and go through. So a few more things. I just got another maybe 15 minutes to go, and there will be time for a few questions. If you do have any questions, pop them in the chat box, and Renu will help me answer them. So the key traits that have changed during the crisis, we have become, on average, 36% more introverted and reflected. Now remember, this is data this is lockdown data, not data post lockdown, but when we're locked down, this is a spread of the data. The bulk of it is here. There are some people that are less introverted and reflective, but most of us have become more introverted and reflective. This is 4,400 people globally. And actually risk reacting and vigilant, we've become 28% more risk averse in this period. Not everybody. This one here, this is probably Donald Trump refusing to wear masks, and he's become less risk averse, hence some of the challenges with COVID in the White House, but most of us have become more risk averse. In terms of our spontaneity, we are 20% less spontaneous and inspired. Not everybody. There are some people that are probably breaking the lockdown rules and being more spontaneous. And again, with sociable, this is the biggest one. We're sociable animals, and the reason we've had a mental health crisis is, in this research, and this is the same in China, the US, everywhere, 44% less sociable and extroverted during lockdown. And for some of us, that's a really big impact. But again, not everybody. As I say, my son Josh, using social media, is just as sociable as he was before. He's quite happy. So not everybody. Yeah. So there's a question coming in from Patricia, the link between mental health and communication. The slide showed mental health scores, but doesn't show the communication measure. Yeah, I could share that data with you separately after this, Patricia. So what it's showing is there was a measure of how well communication occurred. And as the effectiveness of the communication went down in the eyes of the employee, in a separate assessment, their risk of a mental health issue went up. So it was sort of that was the correlation. As communication degraded, mental health risk increased. Yeah, it didn't measure whether they had an actual mental health episode. These were questions that are used by psychiatrists to see if there is a risk of a mental health issue, which is more appropriate to share with 4,000 people globally. Does that answer your question, Patricia? Yes, okay, great. And we'll send out a link afterwards with a paper supporting this. Anyone that wants to engage in a dialogue, it is my favorite topic. I'll happily have an email exchange or share more with you if that's your desire. A couple of things just to state the obvious in terms of income. 7% of us globally have got better off in this crisis. About half of us are actually, after furlough money and so on, in a similar position, but 47% of people are actually worse off, and 1 in 5 people are significantly worse off during the crisis. I think we know that, but it's interesting to see it. Are we working harder? Well, actually, 1 in 5 of us are working fewer hours. That includes people who are furloughed or who can't work so effectively at home. About 1/3 of us are working the same hours. But here's the interesting thing. 43% of us are working harder. Remember, this is people that work in offices are now working remotely, on the whole, white collar workers. We're actually working harder. In other words, the time we save from our commute is going back into our work, at least for 43% of us. And that is moderated by our personality. So those of us on the call here today who are naturally disciplined, those of us who are naturally conscientious and structured, the bad news for you guys is you're the people that are working even harder. Your inner diligence is coming through. People like myself who are higher on inspiration driven, we're still working harder, but not quite as hard, because we're more prone to getting distracted by social media or looking out the window and so on. This is a model of how we respond to stressful situations when there's a stimulus. Some of us respond confidently, optimistically, and so on. Some of us are more vigilant, we're quite modest, we're self-critical, we can be quite impassioned and get a bit fiery. And the interesting thing here is there's a link to brain chemistry. At the top here, we're more focused on going for reward. Down the bottom, it links to serotonin, and we're more focused on wanting to make things safe. And what we found in the research was people who are naturally higher here tended to want to be more productive and autonomous and like it, whereas the people who are naturally higher here, it tended to accentuate anxiety. So in a Chinese study, an academic paper published, it was found that the main concern was worrying about unemployment. I think we found in Western countries it was also worrying about the disease, but in China, the biggest concern was unemployment. And the main protective factor was resilience and optimism. And many of us on the call here today, I think we are engaged in putting programs in place to help employees become more resilient and optimistic. So there are these, although these are personality traits, we can work on them and we can develop them as well. So, I mean, other interesting things, it was also found if you're more introverted and agreeable and nice, you are less likely to feel that you could overcome the difficulties, and the people higher on those risk reactors reported as well in the research losing more sleep and becoming less decisive, which is really just a sign of the anxiety being amplified by the crisis. So actually, that's everything I wanted to say, and I did want to make just 5 minutes at the end for further questions. So I think, Renu, we're on track, which is good. Just before we take the questions, there is a link here if you want to click on it. Afterwards, you'll get the slides. If you've not done the Lumina Spark before, you can fill it in. If you're really keen, I'll put you into the research pot for the second wave of COVID research, which we're just about to kick off to find out how people are coping now. And we will send out a short research paper, as well as the slides summarizing some of the findings from today. But that's probably enough from me. Renu, are there any questions in the chat box, or do you want to just open it up to the floor to see what people might want to ask?
We don't have any questions at the moment, so let's see if feel free to ask any questions, and if you raise your hand or just type, if you would like to speak.
People just unmute themselves. Can we let people just unmute? Is that possible? Yeah.
Yes.
So if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself, and that would be fine. Whoever unmutes first gets the floor. Yeah. Or you can have 5 minutes back to do your emails if you prefer. That's also possible.
So there you go. We're allowed
Yeah.
people to talk. So hopefully.
So
Hi, Dr. Stewart. Thank you so much for holding this talk for us. Just checking, the period of your study was most likely in the initial stages of the lockdown, yeah?
That's right. So the research, the data on remote working and so on, it really took place from sort of May all the way through to September last year. So the bulk of it was when many people in the world were locked down. Yeah. And I am undertaking a second piece of research now to see how people experienced the second wave and so on, and to see how people experience, you know, going back to work, which is sort of, well, we're already at work really, but blending the remote work with possibly office work. Yes.
Sure. I look forward to possibly participating in your second part of the study, because I agree with the findings and the research that was done in the initial stages, but now I see that things and the dynamics and the way of communicating and people's relationships with one another, it has become more different. I'm actually based in Singapore, and so you can see a drastic shift in the way things are currently being handled. So if you can just include me in your next study.
I will be delighted to include you, and thank you for being willing to do that. Every data point is precious, and I do accept things are moving on, which is why we're doing more research on it. Although I think the one thing that hasn't changed is that people do want to work remotely at least some of the time. I think that key finding has been verified by other people's research, including the research from all the travel managers in companies and so on. Yeah.
That is true. We were in the midst of having like work from home and work from the office every alternate day, or like every 2 days per week, and that seemed a lot of us had actually really blended in, you know, assimilated into this arrangement, and we actually liked it very much. In fact, we were looking forward to it going on for a longer period of time. Unfortunately, we are under lockdown here in Singapore all over again. So it's back to working from home and everything.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So we do see in other data, there is sort of fatigue with working from home. So there may have been an initial lift in the economy, but some people have had enough of it and want to come back, although some haven't. So you are right, it is evolving over time. What will be interesting to see is the changes in our personality. Will any of those be permanent, or when the vaccines really kick in, which I think
in fact, I think
revert back.
Sure, there was just an article in the Straits Times like today, which mentioned about a lot of employees who are actually working from home facing burnout. So, you know, that would be an interesting aspect for you to consider looking into as well.
Yeah, if you could respond and let me know where that research is, I'd love to have a look at it, because
for sure,
I have a strong feeling that is moderated by our personality. There are certain types of people that are more prone to just doubling down and working harder, and therefore at risk of burnout. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll share the link with you on the chat box. Just give me a few minutes. Yeah.
That's really great. Thank you.
Thanks, Kuntal. Stuart, we have a question from Mark. Mark, I saw you raise hand, so go for it, Mark.
Hi, Stuart. A great presentation. Thank you. I'm just wondering if you've got any age-related data. I do some training at the moment with 18 to 25-year-olds who are all loving working from home. But my worry for them is that they're going to miss out on all the informal learning.
Yes.
And what they think now is a benefit for them, actually, longer term, is going to be a real detriment to their careers.
Yes, I think I share your concern. I do have age data. In truth, I've not sliced the data and analysed it. It would be really interesting to do so. So I would wonder, actually, is there a difference in age as to who wants to work at home and not? And your question is, could it have an impact? Yeah, I mean, I've recruited some new employees in this crisis, and they've joined in a virtual world, and that's quite hard for them, even if they don't know it's quite hard. They are,
Yeah.
as you say, they're missing out. It's harder to give the full experience.
I think if you're an experienced person and who knows their job, then working from home is great, and you're for all the reasons you've said. But for somebody younger, they see the immediate benefits of, well, I can do this from a bedroom, which seems to be what they're doing. But the reality is they're missing out on so much learning. And
they are. No, I've seen
networking
that. I've seen that in my own organisation. So some of the younger people have also reported after a period of time, because my staff have been working remotely for a year. Some of them have reported that their motivation is dipping, and partly they're not getting the development that they would have got if we were face to face. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
Absolutely it is a factor. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Really, really good question.
Thank you, Mark. I think we have. Shall we take just one more question?
Take one more. Squeeze it in. Yeah.
Apologies if I got your pronouncing your name wrong. Age Bounds. Would you like to go for it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. It's very interesting, the data, the outcomes of your research. Out of interest, I just want to find out, or want to know, what's the purpose of collating this data? What outcomes are you hoping to achieve? Because we can see the impact of the lockdown and all that's going on, the crisis. It's just out of interest. Sorry, I've got a wild mind, and I'm not wondering, okay, you've got all this data, what next?
It's a good question, because I've really just presented like 10% of what can be done with this data. So I was curious about two things. One, I was curious about how does our personality impact our response to the crisis, but also vice versa, how does the crisis impact our personality? Does it change? So firstly, I'm interested in that partly from an academic point of view, but also to help organizations understand the importance of personality in setting policy. So that was one research objective. The second one was to understand the impact of remote working, because all organizations are grappling with that, and to help understand which employees do and don't want to work remotely, including Mark's point about age differences and so on, to help shed light on how we devise remote working strategies. So that was the second purpose. I guess the final third purpose was just to ask staff openly, what do you want, so that I could feed back to employers what they want. And I think the message was, staff want better communication, they want help with their emotional well-being, and they want practical help on how to work remotely, technology and process wise. So I think that's what I set out to do. I don't know if that came over, because I did present rather a lot, of interesting stuff. What were you thinking? Do you think there's something else we could draw out of this data that might be helpful?
Well, like a lot of data you're presenting, well, thank you for your response. That's quite helpful. That's very helpful. A lot of data you were presenting was like on a global scale. So it wasn't by employer or by organization, so I was wondering, okay, where's this leading to? What's the purpose of this? And it's very interesting. So are you like targeting organizations? Are you doing it by country? I didn't quite.
So today I've gone sort of global, but there were a number of organizations that took part in this research in exchange for a similar analysis really for their organization. So the answer is yes, I do have specific organizational analysis where anywhere between 20 and 100 people in an organization gave their view, and this was used to help shape that organization's response. The data there, it does vary a lot by organization, as you can imagine. So, a professional services firm is quite different to, a call center and so on. So, and quite different in how much people want to work remotely. So yes, some of this was geared to support individual organizations. And some of the analysis was done at a country level. So I presented recently to the Canadian HR Association, and I just filtered out the Canadian data so that it spoke to everybody in Canada, for example. But today you've got the global data.
Yay, we're lucky. Thank you.
Great.
Great question. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone. So we've got another question, but perhaps we will follow that up if that's okay, Stuart, conscious of the time.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and lots of great questions. And I have taken a lot from this webinar myself as well, Stuart. Thank you for sharing that data.
Well, thank you for inviting me in. Thank you to you. Thank you to Talent Grader, actually for your platform physically, and also the platform to speak to really key, brilliant people here today. It's always a pleasure to partner with you, Renu, particularly anything to do with thought leadership and your innovation is always great to be associated with. So thank you too. And thank you to everyone for listening and being curious around my ramblings and my research. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.